Hello, everyone. We're coming to you from sunny California to welcome you to our today's webinar, Preventing Data Loss with Backups. My name is Val, and as a brand evangelist here at Sucuri, I'll be your moderator today. But before I hand it over to Victor, our presenter, just a few housekeeping rules. First, would like to hear from you during today's presentation. So if you have a question for our presenter, please feel free to send it through the Q&A tab in your Zoom window, or you can also tweet us at Sucuri Security using the hashtag AskSucuri. Victor will be answering questions at the end of the session, but if we don't get to your question during today's webinar, please feel free to follow up with us via email, as we will be sending all the questions to all registrants. Of course, questions and answers from today will be also made available on our website. Now, today's webinar will also be available as a video recording, and all slides will be sent to all registrants. We'd like to encourage you to share today's webinar with your friends and followers on your social profiles. And before you exit the webinar, please take a moment to answer our brief survey questions. And with that, I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Victor Santoyo. Victor, welcome, and please take it away.
Thank you, Val. As Val mentioned, we're based out of Southern California today. If you know me, a little bit about me first for people who aren't too familiar. Basically, sorry about that. Been with Sucuri for about 3 years. It'll be coming up in April, so I've been with the company a long time. A bit more about me is that I have a 2-year-old son whose birthday actually coincides right along that date. So April's a big month. And I also speak Spanish, based out of Miami, Florida, which is where I speak it predominantly. But as we're out of actually Sucuri headquarters today. So if you do hear some noise in the background, it's essentially our team working hard to make sure we keep your site safe. So if you hear it, don't worry about it too much. But in any events, what are we here to talk about today? Well, backups. Val touched on that a little bit about preventing data loss. And so I want to focus on a couple of aspects about backups. So a lot of people understand the idea of even the manual process of doing so, right? Uploading, downloading, or auto restore functions. But I want to focus on more specific aspects of backups that people often either overlook or misunderstand. First, why it shouldn't be considered a replacement for your website security solution. Secondly, more importantly, how to properly deploy backups, and as well as best practices that'll help fit the mold of your website, right? What does your website need in terms of a proper backup strategy? Now, there are a lot of tools online, plugins and stuff to help automate a lot of this process, but just consider this webinar more of a guide and maybe highlighting some aspects of existing tools you might be using, and maybe thinking back on whether those tools that you are using might be, suiting the need. So, first misconception, of course, is I don't need website security because I have backups. Well, that's not necessarily true, right? I mean, when all else fails and everything's broken, your site's not available, sure, it brings your site back. But let's be a bit more cautious about when we talk about if backups means security, all right? So let's consider this. Why shouldn't backups act as my existing security strategy? Well, as I just touched on, backups will absolutely revert your site content back and bring it back online. But it only brings it back online based on when the backup was last previously set. And depending on the frequency, there may be a gap in between in terms of content that you might have lost. And if you're updating your site with a lot of content, then that might mean a lot of content that you've lost as a result within that gap. Second aspect, of course, is simply you bring your site back online, but it doesn't actually fix the problem, right? It doesn't keep attackers from maybe identifying your website again and then just going right back in to exploit whatever existing vulnerability was there in the first place. The site will still be bare, and we're always going to recommend, of course, some kind of proactive layer or defensive strategy like a web application firewall to ensure the site remains safe. But in the moment, if you don't have some kind of a workflow like that in place as it is, backups can help bring the site back online, but we've seen reinfections happen within hours. And of course, the last aspect of this is simply that sometimes backups may not work as intended. We had a case where a client came to us and we had to help them remediate a lot of malware. But the main issue they were having is that they had originally a dedicated server that was commissioned by an older developer. And the server that the developer had set up for them had pretty big stability issues. So the developer kind of moved on. Obviously they had a different opportunity for them, and the client was sort of left trying to figure out what to do next. Now, part of the problems they were also facing, email wasn't functioning properly. So the host wasn't actually, alerting them properly to some of the issues they were facing. And by the time that the client had been made aware of the issue, um, the hard drive failed. The server wasn't responding at all. Now, while they had some backups in place, set up in a certain way, not all the content from the website was there. And in fact, what was there, a good percentage of it also was corrupted, meaning the backups that were set up, weren't functioning, and essentially they lost everything because, on top of everything else, the backups were set up on that same hard drive. So imagine, you think you have a backup strategy in place, and it may be a band-aid while you look for a security solution, but then the backups fail, and you've lost all your content anyway. Now, with that, also want to keep in mind that an example like this, where you may be in the process of maybe handing the reins off to someone else, or maybe managing the security or the management of your website as well, knowing what previous administrators or developers had in place will be key. An example like the previous one, knowing what kind of issues the server was facing, will be really important for you. Another common issue we've seen in the past, and was relayed to us from another website owner, was that another developer of a different client, also moving on, handed the complete reins of their hosting account to the website owner. Now, the owner wasn't necessarily very proficient or didn't exactly know how to navigate their cPanel or anything like that, but the fact was the responsibility was on them. But the website owner didn't ask enough questions of the developer about what was already in place. They knew on their bill they were paying for backups through their host, so they assumed that backups were set up. And they faced a hack, and they were facing all kinds of issues, and the website owner thought, well, let me go fetch my previous backup while I figure out something else. So they went to the host, but the host notified them, well, yeah, you have backups available, but they were never set up. So client gets upset, goes to the developer and says, well, hey, what happened? I thought we had backups on our website. And developer told them, well, I mean, yeah, you had it available, but never set up. And I told you to go through your account. And as a result, a lot of the content updates, a lot of the configuration settings they had made over a course of about 4 to 5 months, if I remember correctly, were lost, just gone. So biggest thing here especially is, don't want you guys to feel like you're left hanging. If you do end up in a situation like this where an administrator or developer is moving on and you need a transition, when it comes to backups, and really just about most things in general, know what they had in place, and so you're not caught off guard in a situation like this. So now that we understand why backups won't necessarily be a good replacement for security, or how to address incidents, how do you properly deploy backups? So we're going to go over a number of topics, and we'll go a bit more in depth in each. But basically, these are going to be the things you'll want to consider when you're trying to identify a proper backup strategy for you. The frequency, right? How often are those backups running? The types of backups that you'll have. There are different types of backups, and it's not a universal thing. Which files should you back up? Right? Where will those backups be located? And along with that as well, the data that's included in the file structure. And the last part, and it kind of goes back to the story we were just saying, making sure you consider talking to your hosting provider about their existing policies on backups and potential options that they might have for you. So let's touch on the frequency, right? First things first is understanding the kind of content that you have driven on your website. If you generate a lot of content, then it's really important to consider a backups solution that'll update very frequently, right? You might have a daily setup, maybe every 2 days, every week. How often are you posting? The last thing you don't want is that gap in between where you lose content unnecessarily because the frequency just wasn't adjusted to your needs. Similarly, if you don't update as often, make sure the backups match that. If you don't want to have too much redundancy, then ratchet down the frequency on that as well. Consider the retention period. How far back do you need those backups? A lot of places do them for a month, 90 days, forever. Do you need that much history of your backups? Think about even so the history of your project. So do you need to establish, let's say, baselines where you might have tested a different theme or a premium plugin just to see how it functions? Maybe you want to then set aside a backup right before you make that change so you can revert to something in the event that those changes go wrong. And more importantly, how often are they checked? How often do you know that those backups actually succeeded? In some cases, backups can fail. So knowing how often you should be checking back wherever you have your backup set up, seeing all the green check marks will be just as important. Now we go into the types of backups. Now, a lot of people, I think, have this understanding that when you back up your website, you're backing up everything. Well, that is one way of doing it. That's called a full backup, right? Entire file structure, your entire database, and that gets backed up, on top of each other over and over. But we do have two different types of backups as well, and different providers may implement a different way. For example, incremental backups. So incremental backups work this way. You set it up initially, and yes, it's a full backup to start. But from there, incremental backups will then back up the files that have been changed or modified since that last backup, right? So then after that, your backup vendor will then check for the next most recent changes and back up those specific files. So it'll do a couple things. Obviously, it'll help save space. If you have a 100 or 200 gigabit website, and if you're going to set up daily backups, then backing up every day for 200 gigabytes may not make sense if you don't have that much space. Incremental backups might be something for you. Differential backups works slightly differently. How that works is that it'll back up everything since the previous full backup, right? So let's say in this case, maybe you do a full backup every month. Differential backups will save everything from that date. Now, from here, we have to understand which files are worth backing up, right? Most people might consider, oh, well, let's back up everything. That seems like the most logical. But if you are running on a popular CMS platform like WordPress, Drupal, Magento, or the like, then really you only need a copy of certain aspects of that file structure that actually do change, like themes and plugins, extensions, and the like. WordPress, as a good example, right? Popular. Really, all you'll need to ever copy or back up with them is your WP content directory, your WP config file, because really that's really where the bulk of those changes are made. The rest of the files and folders that are part of the WordPress installation as a whole don't typically need to be backed up because they're readily available and don't get touched. Now, be cautious though. If you are one that's making custom configurations or changes to that core, well, then in those cases, backing up the entire installation will be absolutely pivotal. Of course, you see it there at the bottom. It seems redundant, but backing up the backups as well will also be important. You just never really know when you may need them. And I'm going to go through in the next slide an example of where backing up those backups will also be important in certain situations. So we know how often we should maybe back up, and which files we should back up as well. Well, where does this happen? A lot of people have an understanding that I've spoken to about, backing up within where, your production environment sits, right? Backing up inside of a different directory or something. But realistically, you should isolate both things, right? Let's consider the first story I mentioned, where they had their backup set up on the production environment, their server, but that got completely corrupted, which then also completely squashed their existing backups that they had. So keeping them separate, whether it's just different servers or offsite or a cloud remote storage, may pay a lot of dividends when you face a crisis like that. Using both physical and remote locations. So I just touched on using cloud storage, right? Some people might use Dropbox. Some people might use a vendor that be utilizing their own cloud network where the backups are stored. We do that, for example. But even understanding having like a physical copy of that on an external hard drive, right? Backing up your backups both on cloud storage and then backing that up on an external hard drive may also be really fruitful for you. Why would you do that? Well, suppose you're somewhere where you just don't have internet access and you need to access those files. If I have that hard drive, I can connect that into my desktop and then, you know, work within, let's say, my sandbox or something, and then navigate my file structure from there. I at least have access to them from a physical remote, or I should say, physical mobile device that allow me to get my access to my files straight away. Think about the data and where they can be accessed on these backups, right? A lot of times people say, okay, well, I work from my laptop. I'm the only person accessing my desktop, so I don't have to worry about that. But a lot of agencies might work out of an office, might share access to cloud storage like Dropbox, right? Who has permissions to access certain directories if you have specific concerns about the data you're backing up? GDPR is going to be something as well that you should consider with this, right? Where is that data being stored so that you don't run into fees or fines when you might break compliancy there. So consider this: if you have personally identifiable information and data that gets backed up, make sure that's somewhere where it's going to be safe and secure. Don't have that backed up, let's say, on your home office where you might have kids going onto your computer, trying to play games, open up a file, open up a directory or something, and they have access to information they shouldn't. That's definitely something you don't want to run into as well. Now, as we wrap up, sort of want to also talk about your host. Obviously, most people may consider the idea of, well, I can just go to my host. My host should take care of that. Well, talk to them first. A lot of times hosts do have backups available, but really it's sort of backups to suit their needs. And sometimes the backups that they may be able to offer you may take a few days, may take a while. They may not even be accessible to you. So first ask, are they available? Are they included within my fees? If not, how much are they? And then go through the list of questions that we've come to this point with your host about, well, okay, if it's going to be a few dollars per site every month, then how often are they going to run? Where are they going to be stored? How am I going to access them? Is it going to be readily available within my dashboard, or will I have to submit an inquiry with support and wait for office hours to get my backup back online? Are there limitations, right? Storage space. If you intend to use a backup solution, for example, that'll be a full backup. Will I have enough space for those backups to live, or do I need to consider something different? So, you see all these questions keep sort of circling back to, the same point, which is just having a full understanding of how often your backups need to run, and ultimately what your website needs in terms of, what kind of content you have out there. Now, the only other thing I want to leave you with in terms of, before we sort of touch all of these points is also the ability for you to, do that either automatically. So we want to talk about the frequency here. We touched on how often your content gets changed, the types of backups, whether it's full or maybe incremental, which is popular, which files, if you're using something like WordPress, there's only going to be so many files you should back up, the location of them, which is whether you lean on a cloud storage or whether you decide to manually do it yourself. And talking to your host, do you have an option as well to auto restore, right? If you are going through your host, will they be able to simply click one button and then you be able to restore that right back into your hosting environment? Or will you need to download them locally and then upload them manually as well? I think the only other point left when it comes to backups, and I know we've talked a bit about it to this point, is testing your backups. Knowing that they work is absolutely key. Just simply because you know that they run at the frequency you need, they're set up in a storage area that you feel confident in, does not necessarily mean that the backups work. Design a time and a plan to try and test a few files on a different computer or from a different location so you can test this plan before you will actually need it. And then you're not caught off guard when you face a moment that you thought everything was fine, but then the backups fail. With that, I hopefully you took away something from this webinar today in terms of at least having a better understanding of the specific needs of your website and how backups may play a role. I'll shoot this back to Val, and if you guys have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Oh, thanks, Victor. That's a lot of information. I'm sure anybody not having backups activated already making a plan after this webinar to contact at least their hosting provider and see if they're set up or if they're included or not. We do have some questions that we'll try to get to. And then again, of course, I see some of the questions asking us if we are going to provide the recording. And yes, we are going to provide the recording of this webinar as well as the slides Victor used, as we do for all of our webinars. So don't worry about that one. So the first question for Victor here is, how many days does Sucuri Backups keep data for?
Well, our backups are set up to run or to keep everything for 90 days. So that's our retention period. In terms of the how our backups are set up based on the information I provided you, we use incremental backups. That's how we do it. And those 90 days are readily available on the dashboard. You would not have to reach out to our support in order to fetch them for potential needs. And we do also have available, one-click restore options. So it's much easier for you to restore your site back in the event that you do face a crisis.
That was actually the second question that somebody had, if the auto restore is included or not. So thanks for jumping into that one as well. There's another question here it's a question for hosts, but maybe you can shed some light into that one. Do all web hosts offer backups?
Hard to say, and don't want to presume in terms of what any specific host may have. Like I mentioned, a lot of what hosts may have may be designed to suit their needs in terms of backing up the server itself, or maybe they do incorporate some type of backups, but that's definitely where you want to open up a conversation and lines of communication with your host, or even an account manager you might have if you have a managed host, in terms of what do you guys do if I do lose my data or my website content, how fast can I get my files back if you did back up, and probably more importantly, how far back do you guys even do this? Is it weekly, bi-weekly? So definitely I would suggest just talking to your host, and they'd be able to provide you much better context for that.
Great. What if my website is hacked right now? Can backups be a help to me? Can they help me in the meantime?
Depends, not necessarily. So a lot of times what people might run into is, let's say a website gets hacked, defaced, or maybe they've encountered ransomware. That's something that's been coming up with it. They revert to a backup, thinking everything's fine, but you won't necessarily know if, let's say, the backups that you bring back online may include a backdoor that just hasn't been triggered yet. A lot of times files are injected and embedded, but don't necessarily act right away. And there's no way for you to know unless you've got some kind of monitoring tool in place to identify unusual files, when that might have been. So backups can certainly help you short term, but that won't necessarily stop an attacker from maybe using that backdoor to regain access and exploit whatever vulnerability they found. So that's why a defense in depth strategy is absolutely key. Having a proactive layer in front to block those potential threats, and even having some visibility tools to identify unusual files being uploaded to your file structure. Those are going to be key. Backups only play a specific role, and they can help in a short period of time, but long term, definitely consider a more broad strategy.
Great. We have one more question. Actually, it's a little bit longer one, but I'll try to go through it. So what type of software or tools would you use to back up manually, like instead of going through a vendor, and if that's also a safe choice or not?
Well, for example, something I've used in the past is, FileZilla, right? Using your SFTP to download locally and upload through FileZilla, something I use. That's a solid software most, I think, use. But that might also be another question you speak to your vendor or your host about, whether they have a preferred software and then getting familiar with that. But FileZilla is something I would recommend in terms of using for something like this, if you decide to approach backups through a manual process.
Great. Well, thanks, Victor. For anyone watching right now, we do have a little question at the end. We'd like to know if you guys want us to reach out to you, or if you want Victor to answer any questions following the webinar. Please use the poll window that you see in front of you and send in your answer. And we are thankful that you joined us this morning, or whatever time locally for you right now is. For some of you in Europe, it could be in the afternoon or right in the evening, and we do appreciate your time and patience. We hope this has been a useful introductory into backups. And if you have any questions, I'm sure Victor will be happy to follow up. You can email him, as he said, victor@sucuri.net. You can tweet at us. You can send us questions via our channels. We'll be more than happy to answer. And with that, I would just say thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you, Victor, for allowing some of your time of this day to be used for this webinar. And we'll just say goodbye here.
Bye, everybody.